Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. On Monday, January 20th, Donald Trump took office as the 47th President of the United States. Now in his second term, Trump's inauguration heralds a new era for both the United States and the world. President Trump has already signed numerous executive orders to set his agenda in motion, including measures to deploy troops to the southern border, renege on climate commitments, and withdraw from the World Health Organization. His expressed desire to impose tariffs on key U.S. partners, threatening comments about Greenland and the Panama Canal, and plans to negotiate a settlement to the Ukraine war have the potential to further shake up U.S. foreign policy and global geopolitics. At home, the questions loom just as large. Many of his nominations appear set to sail through the confirmation process. The tech titans have opted to fall in line, intent on avoiding any ire from the president. Indeed, Trump's control over the Republican Party has grown significantly from his first term in office, raising questions about where constraints on the executive will come from in the event of any executive overreach. To help us think through all of these very big questions, we're pleased to have with us today Robert Kagan. Bob, welcome. We're so happy to have you on Brussels Sprouts.
Well, thank you for having me.
Very quick introduction. Bob Kagan is the Stephen and Barbara Friedman Senior Fellow with the Strobe Talbott Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. All right, Bob, you anticipated Trump's return to the presidency, I think, all the way back to at least 2021, if not earlier. So tell us a little bit about why this is all in no way surprising to you at a time when so many believe that Trump, with all his legal issues and other baggage, was unelectable.
Well, what's made Trump powerful is a very devoted movement within the Republican Party. I would have said at another time that it really represents maybe 40 to 60% of the Republican Party, but which in primaries is enough, obviously, to be dominant. The question always is, and by the way, that group I think is clearly motivated by a desire to fundamentally change the American system, not simply to, fix the price of eggs. We're talking about people who are fundamentally white Christian nationalists. That's a very important part of the movement. You could see that Trump made himself the representative of white Americans in particular. From the moment he started running for president in 2011, he was focused on the birther controversy, having to do with whether America's first black president was actually, legitimately elected, which was a signal to those people. And that is a dominant force, which the rest of the Republican Party has been running away from and attempting to appease. And it's through this sort of populist movement. I don't even like calling it populist because I don't even think the key issue is that they're populist. I think the key issue is that they are that it is fundamentally white Christian nationalism. The rest of the party's gone along out of political necessity, out of political survival, but to the point where now there are no fundamental checks on what Donald Trump wants to do. They would, at this point, they would have to come from the party because the Republicans control both houses. They would have to come from the Supreme Court, but it's clear that there are at least 3, 4, or 5 justices who are committed to helping Donald Trump in whatever way they can. So what we're facing is unchecked power. How did we get here? I wrote a book published a book last year called Rebellion, which really traces this, what I regard as a fundamentally anti-liberal, and by liberal I mean the founders' liberalism, the Declaration of Independence, that this has been there's been a fundamental anti-liberal movement in America since the very beginning, and it periodically has been dominant during the 19th century and well into the early 20th century. We've had a period of dominant liberalism since World War II, but I think that those days are clearly over, and now we're back to a more reactionary America, at least in terms of the majority. Anyway, we can go on and talk about a lot of things, but that's the fundamental premise.
Yeah, so you could take that in a lot of different directions, which I will, but maybe just starting with what you were there on at the end is, what does Trump's reelection say about the United States? I mean, as you described, it was ultimately about, from the beginning, white Americans, but he's drawn in lots of different minority groupings. He won the popular vote this time. And, with the first time in office, I think many of our European allies and other allies could say, well, that was just a one-off. And then when we were done, oh, thank goodness we got through that. But now he's back. And so how do you think about what his reelection means for where the United States is?
Well, it's a good question, but it's clear. Well, first of all, I think it's important that the dominant narrative continues to be that the Democrats lost the so-called working class, that this was fundamentally an election about economics and about how certain Americans feel left behind in the system. And I reject that interpretation of the election. I do think this election was primarily about, we'll put it under the broad category of woke, but basically it is a rebellion by men against the increasing rights and protections that are afforded to women. It is which, by the way, explains some of the I think it explains some of the very small movement of black votes toward Trump. And I want to say, it's amazing to me, and I this is named at you, but we keep talking about the fundamental realignment, which goes to non-white groups as well. And except for the large Latino vote, which, by the way, Latinos have voted Republican frequently in large numbers in the past, there really wasn't that much movement. I mean, the black vote was still something like 88% to 12%. It was not fundamental. The tendency of the Democratic Party to go into a panic because it's lost its constituency has led it to the wrong, in my view, prescription and diagnosis. First of all, the Democratic Party lost the working class a long time ago to some extent. And I believe that it lost it based on these what we call these cultural issues. But I think they're really about race, religion, ethnicity. All those things drove this vote. And as you could see, this administration is not doing anything for the working class. It's the biggest collection of billionaires probably in any administration ever. And what are their first actions? Their first actions are about immigration, which is the poison the blood campaign, which is definitely about race and ethnicity, et cetera. And the DEI stuff that they're doing, which, by the way, you don't have to defend DEI or not DEI, but at least we understand what this is about. What he's delivering to people is on the woke, racial, religious, et cetera front, not on the working class front.
Well, Bob, it's great to have you on. This is a great thrill, and if you don't watch out, we're going to start calling you all the time, and you'll have to run away from us and hide. But you can't hide, so just know that. But anyway, it's great to have you here. I want to take us back to Andrea's point about the administration and the allies. And I want to try to tie in your thinking on this too. In fact, I wasn't going to raise this, but I was thinking my students at Sciences Po would never forgive me if I don't ask you this. But you've become quite famous in our world, international affairs, foreign policy world, with your Venus and Mars analysis of Europe and the United States. That you wrote in a totally different time. In fact, we were all in Brussels, I think, when you wrote that. And you were looking at Europeans as they were then in the United States too. George W. Bush had been elected, and so my question for you is, as Trump is now looking at Europe, and Trump is looking at the allies and looking at tariffs on them, looking at maybe pulling U.S. forces 20,000 out. I heard that. What if you were talking to him, how would you have changed or not changed your analysis of Europe if you were sitting with Trump? He asked you, so what do you think, Bob, about the Europeans these days? I read your piece back from the 80s. How would you now describe the Europe that Trump is going to be dealing with?
Well, I don't think I could successfully explain it to Trump because he just doesn't, you have to understand, we have to understand that when people like Donald Trump look out at the world, they don't see allies. They don't see 70 years of close relations. They see individual countries. If they're run by liberals, whether it's center right or center left, they're inherently hostile to them because they're hostile to liberalism. And they don't look at the world in those terms. And I think that's new, and I think it could be to some extent generational. Although Donald Trump is old enough theoretically to understand alliances, this has more to do with his personality. I don't think he believes in allies personally, let alone internationally. But I think a
Right.
lot of other Americans, it's been so long since we remembered why we had allies in the first place that I think that they just look out at the world and they don't see allies, and that's important. But the larger point is, and I think this again is going to be very hard to remind Americans about, that Europe has been the source of the worst wars in our history. Twice the United States was dragged into wars in Europe because in both those cases Germany was seeking hegemony, and Americans decided that was a dangerous thing for them. And so we had a grand strategy, whether it was spoken or unspoken, that the United States was going to end the security crisis, the ongoing and insoluble security crisis of Europe, by fundamentally becoming the guarantor of European security. And even though we wanted them to be able to help deal with that, and they did to some extent during the Cold War, they provided some troops, mostly on their own territory, which made perfect sense. It has not been our policy to hope that they will each individually rearm themselves and return to the kind of Europe that we spent two world wars trying to prevent. And so it's hard to explain to people why it's actually in our interest that, for instance, Germany not rearm sufficiently. So, if we're going to pull out and Germany has to rearm sufficiently to protect itself against Russia, that means it's going to have a full scale, from nuclear weapons on. It has to have a huge military. The rest of Europe is going to have a total panic as soon as Germany acquires that kind of power. So it's always been in our interest for Europeans to do some part of their own protection, but not to venture out as returning to basic nationalist foreign policies of the past. Now, that is what we used to call enlightened self-interest on the part of the United States, but I think we don't have much in the way of enlightenment anymore. And now people want to define self-interest as just looking out for ourselves,
Right.
and having a fundamentally, as we can see, and I'm sure you were going to get into this eventually, a foreign policy about dominating the Western Hemisphere, which is, goes back to sort of not even the end of the 19th century, but sort of mid-19th century American attitudes.
Manifest Destiny is what, Manifest Destiny was once again part of the inaugural address. So,
which is astonishing to me because, are we going to reconquer the continent too? It's already been accomplished. We're already dominant in the hemisphere. So it's very, I would say, as we would say in the business, it's kind of low-hanging fruit for him to promise Western hemispheric dominance. But it clearly comes. It is redolent of a mindset of America of 2 centuries ago, an America which considered Europe to be so far away as to be practically not worth thinking about, and certainly not strategically relevant to the United States. And I think at the root of all this is the fundamental failure to see or understand or care about the strategic relevance of huge parts of the world, namely, East Asia and the Pacific, and Europe and the Atlantic. So that all the things that we learned in the first two wars in the 20th century has now been, I would say, almost completely forgotten, if not positively rejected by Trump and his supporters.
So back to McKinley we go.
Well, it's not McKinley. I guess I guess you're referring to a David Brooks column, which I haven't read yet, so forgive me. But McKinley, was not territorially. He was not interested in aggrandizement territorially. I know this is hard for people to understand. The Philippines were kind of an accident. He did not set out to take the Philippines. He didn't particularly want the Philippines. We don't have time probably to get into all the things. I wrote a book about that too, so you can go back and look at that. But McKinley was already past the point in America where there were territorial designs, and they were already into an idea of global responsibility, which McKinley and more importantly Theodore Roosevelt felt very strongly about America's global responsibility. So I don't think if Republicans these days harking back to those guys, I don't think they understand what those guys were actually about. If you
Right.
want to harken back and be William Henry Seward, because you're taking Alaska, okay, that's good. That's a good 1867 foreign policy.
No, exactly.
So there's the territorial element to this that you are touching on, and the threat of tariffs and kind of like these strong measures. But there's also this political support for a lot of like-minded partners on the far right. I'm thinking of, Elon Musk's wading into German politics and lifting up the AfD and in UK politics. How significant is that? And I guess the question I really wanted to ask is, do you think Trump's election will give oxygen to some of these groups? Are we going to see another uptick in these far right groups in Europe that then, undermine the cohesion of our alliance?
Well, I can't exactly predict. I mean, I suppose it's possible that the Trump administration could give active support to these governments or these movements, like the AfD in Germany, or Elon Musk could give his private money to them, et cetera, which would make a difference. I can't tell, what the fact of Donald Trump does to strengthen these groups. But if it turns out that the United States really does sort of pull back from Europe in a fundamental way, I don't think the problem is only going to be right-wing groups. I think you're going to see European countries having to adjust in the ways that they do. I mean, I'm waiting, honestly, for France to rediscover its traditional relationship with Moscow. I mean, that goes back centuries. France has repeatedly turned to Moscow for, and during the Cold War, they did as well, obviously, to some extent. There is a German trend, historically toward neutralism as one way of solving their problem. If Germany doesn't want to rearm, it has to accommodate. And so I think, so yes, and maybe those other groups in the society will be empowered, but I think the problem will be bigger than the AfD. The United States is going to force European countries to make choices if it's not going to be providing the fundamental protection. And those choices will, I think, in many cases lead, as I say, at least to neutralism as between the two great powers that Europe is stuck between.
I do want to come back to Trump, but just on this point, I mean, to what extent would you anticipate that should we see an end to the war in Ukraine, kind of whenever that is, that then that enables kind of this neutrality that you're talking about, that you get politicians in Europe that say, phew, thank goodness that's passed, and let's go back kind of to some of these more traditional relationships? Or do you think that this war has fundamentally changed the trajectory of politics in places like France and Germany?
That's Venus and Mars right there.
Well, look, it entirely depends on how this war ends. I mean, I think that if it were possible to accomplish even a less good outcome in which Ukraine cedes some territory but is otherwise intact and able to receive support and be defended by the United States and NATO and others, that's one outcome. And that's an outcome which I think, by the way, is ultimately a defeat for Putin, even if it's terrible for Ukraine. I think Putin would regard it as a defeat, which, by the way, is why I don't think he's ever going to accept that, unless he literally is facing the dissolution of his army. I don't think anything short of that is going to. So where we're headed then, assuming that there's no dramatic change in direction in the Trump administration, is toward Ukraine losing. And Ukraine losing is, first of all, going to be extremely ugly. I don't think people really are quite aware of what Ukraine is going to look like if Russia is actually taking control. There's going to be, displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. There's already a kind of gulag in occupied Ukraine. It's a totalitarian society, and it'll be very ugly. But if the American response to the fall of Kyiv is, well, that's a bummer, but we're moving on, I think at that point, the crisis in the alliance really goes into full blown, because I think at that point, European countries really have to say, okay, the Americans are just not playing anymore, and therefore we have to figure out what to do. If you get a different outcome than that, I think that my basic view, by the way, this gets sorry to head up to the 50,000 foot level, but everybody's talking about the decline of America, the end of Pax Americana. I've been reading articles about the end of Pax Americana now for 30, 40 years. But I think that the basic structures of the security order are still in place. It really just requires the right behavior on the part of the United States. I think that Russia is still fundamentally too weak to be the kind of power that Putin wants to be, although winning in Ukraine will help get it there. I think China can be contained. I think we have all these capabilities. It's just that, unfortunately, Americans are actively choosing not to play that role. And if that's the case, then yes, things are going to quickly, I would argue, dissolve. The Europeans can't forever hope to wait for the United States to see reason from their point of view and come back. They'll have to make other arrangements. So the fall of Ukraine, I think, is the turning point.
But just to drill down a little bit on what Andrea was getting at there as well, and I blurted out Venus and Mars. It's interesting because if under that scenario where Ukraine does lose, and this helps propel Russia to become stronger, and as you said, the Europeans are then going to have to decide what next. Do you think, knowing Europe as you do, and as you've written about, do you think Europe today really has it in itself? Germany, France, particularly, UK, do they really have it in themselves to rearm? Or, because we talk about that all the time. I've written stuff, Andrea, others, about Europe has got to fill in the gaps. Europe's got to rearm. Europe's got to carry more of the load, et cetera, et cetera. But even in the worst case scenario, when there is no doubt Europe has got to take on a big defense role to defend against an aggressive and emboldened Russia, do you think they could really pull it off, or are those days really well behind us?
I don't really know I can't say with any confidence what the answer to that is. I would say, just in sort of basic material considerations, it'd be a real problem for Germany to have to. I mean, that would require a huge devotion of the significant portions of the German national budget to get from where they are now, which is basically they couldn't deploy 10,000 or 20,000 troops for more than a few days anywhere in a combat situation, to having a military capable, perhaps with the assistance of others, but certainly it would have to be fundamentally Germany, capable of going toe to toe with the Russian military. That is an enormous expenditure. Even if they had all the will in the world, it would be hard to do. It would be hard for the United States to sort of, triple, I don't even know what it would take, triple, quadruple our defense budget overnight. I think if we were attacked, we might do that. But so I think it's more likely that there will be a long period of trying to adjust. And maybe Putin gets what he wants in Europe, which is essentially a two-tier, I guess if NATO is still in place, but in any case, a two-tier relationship where countries that are regarded as within the Russian sphere of influence, like Poland and much of Eastern Europe, and certainly the Baltic states and elsewhere, are prohibited from being sufficiently armed. They would have to have a sort of secondary status in terms of the alliance with the other powers. I think he would insist on that. Am I 100% confident that the Germans and the French, without any other real options, would go along with that? No, I'm not. I think there would be efforts to make adjustments if the United States is really out of the game. Now, I'll tell you, I think that I don't think the American people are where Trump is, honestly. I at least not yet. Maybe 3 years of, you know, Fox News explaining it to them why nothing in Europe matters. But at the moment, I don't think they're ready to do that. And I actually think and have written that there's going to be a crisis for Trump if Kyiv falls, because I don't think his own party is really ready for a big loss like that. And so I'm not ready. I personally am not ready to say it's all over. So a lot of what I'm talking about, which assumes the United States looking at the fall of Kyiv and just saying, well, fine, we don't care.
Yeah.
It's a far, far place, or whatever the Chamberlain line is. But I actually don't believe that's what the response is going to be. I think the response is going to be a certain level of panic. But you know what? I could be wrong. I base that on looking at 100 years of American history. We have been much more isolationist than we are right now in the past, and yet found certain actions ultimately intolerable. And I think that I'm not yet persuaded that the American people are no longer of that character.
I mean, that's one question that I think we're all getting a lot, which is as we're seeing Trump's tone on Putin and Russia and Ukraine shift. So, these threats about putting on sanctions and tariffs, and we can do this the easy way or the hard way, moving from I'm going to solve Ukraine in one day to it's going to take a while. So we're watching this shift in real time. But what do you think Trump is willing to do to enhance his leverage in a negotiation? Would he go so far as to go back to Congress and ask for a new supplemental to restore military aid to Ukraine? I mean, how far do you think he'd be willing to go? I mean, I guess the other point I always make is when you're dealing with two strongmen and highly personalized leaders, relations are bound to be volatile. They can get along well, but things can explode in spectacular fashion as well. So, I mean, I guess where do you see things headed with Trump and Ukraine in the coming months?
Well, first of all, I think that, the notion that either of these men believe they have a relationship which is worth anything more than, it's possible that Trump does believe it. But it would be pretty amusing, since Donald Trump himself doesn't have any loyalty to anybody or any kind of relationship that means anything. So I don't know why he would assume that Vladimir Putin does, even though he doesn't. I think that Vladimir
romances, right? Like him last time. I mean, he latches on to these figures,
Well, no, it's partly for domestic consumption. His whole point is, I'm a tough guy. The other tough guys know I'm a tough guy, and therefore I can do deals with them because they had contempt for Biden, but I'm a serious guy. And I think Putin, whenever he feels like it, is going to enjoy puncturing that bubble. And I think, by the way, I read the late. I'm going to get to your question eventually, but I mean, I think that the way Trump's latest threat is such a hollow threat. I mean, you're going to put tariffs on Russian goods coming into the United States. There are no Russian goods coming into the United States.
Yeah.
And I would say, if I were reading what Trump was saying, I would say he was begging. He was basically asking Putin, please cut me a solid here and let me get out of this thing. And I think Putin is just going to go, boy, it's really fun watching you guys squirm. I don't think he cares about Donald Trump. He cares about defeating the United States, and he's in the process of doing that. Now I have forgotten the original question you asked me.
How far you think Trump would go?
Oh, how far will Trump go?
To build his leverage. He doesn't want to look like a weak guy,
He doesn't, but I also, it is possible, of course, that he will decide that he wants, that in order to get the deal he wants, he understands that he's got to threaten Putin with a long-term commitment to Ukraine. Because, by the way, Putin has seen this show before. If Trump says, I'm going to do it for another 6 months and then see what happens, Putin's going to say, great, I'll wait 6 months and then we'll see what happens. So Trump would really have to be all in. He'd have to be convincingly all in order to get this kind of deal. I think that's too much of a shift for Trump. I think for him to now turn around and say it's in our vital interest to provide Ukraine aid, I find that, which would be the case. And then, by the way, then he's on Ukraine's side. Then he's committed to helping Ukraine. And if I were advising him, I would say, that's good. You need to do that. But I can't guarantee you a victory anytime soon. So, enjoy your war. I think that if I had to guess, I believe that Trump will, give it his best shot without really going for an aid program. And hope that Putin, a lot of people have believed in you could read it in the pages of our foreign policy magazines. There's all kinds of people every day saying Putin needs a deal. His economic system economy's in a toilet. So he's going to come forward. Those are American analysts. So why should Trump be smarter than they are in that sense? These are our colleagues in many cases writing this stuff. So why shouldn't Trump believe that? But I do believe at the end of the day, he can and will say, I didn't lose this war. The Biden administration lost the war. I
Right.
inherited a loser. The Biden administration had us on a losing trajectory, and I couldn't do anything about it. And I'm sorry that this happened, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. And it's all Biden's fault. And anyway, what about Greenland? I do think that is in. If you had to make me put money on the line right now, I would say that. Now, there are a lot of people that I respect who are hopeful still that Trump is going to do something else. There's a piece by Mark Thiessen and Jack Keane about, doing Lend-Lease, which is a very clever idea if you can sell it. We know what happened to the Lend-Lease aid that we gave in the Second World War. We didn't exactly get the equipment back, as far as I can recall, but at the end of the day, and meanwhile, by the way, they are purging everybody in the government everywhere, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the National Security Council, of anyone who ever had a kind word to say about Ukraine. So while they're doing that on the one hand, they're also going to be providing aid to Ukraine on the other. I just find it implausible.
And there's
Not impossible.
I want to come back to the domestic, but go ahead, Jim.
I said there's the Congress too. I mean, I would look forward to seeing Trump turn to the Congress and say, "All right, let's get a package going for Ukraine assistance," and then watching the MAGA people's heads explode on the Hill. Like, well, what do you mean? I mean, that's.
But I think they would do it. I mean, like Bob's point. I mean, he's purging anyone and has like so cowed or threatened or intimidated anyone who would stand up to him otherwise. I guess it's my sense that if Trump felt like he had to go there, the Republican Party would fall in line and they would get the deal. They would get the package passed.
Well, enough of them would. You'd have almost unanimous Democratic support, and therefore you wouldn't even need the whole Republican Party to go along. I think if he wants to pass aid through Congress, Congress will pass the aid. That's not the problem. The problem is, I think, the one big faction which clearly has control, at least over personnel in the government, is going to be outraged, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not even sure Donald Trump worries about that. I think he thinks he's got, I think he's got all the power. I just don't think he wants to do it. Honestly, I don't think he wants to, it will become his war. Now, I think the problem that he doesn't understand is it's going to be his war anyway. And if you go back in history, it doesn't matter if the previous president was the one who actually screwed up. If it falls on your watch, you're the one who's going to pay the political price for it. And I think you can go through, the last 50 years and see that. Jimmy Carter, it wasn't really Jimmy Carter's fault that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, but it had a huge impact on him that it did. And it won't be Trump's fault that in some respects that Ukraine is in the shape that it's in. It is the Biden administration's fault, but he will still pay the price for it. So, and who knows how he'll respond to that knowledge. And somewhere in his soul, he knows that he's going to pay a price for it, which I think explains the tough rhetoric. He's kind of between, he's got to look tough while caving. It'll be quite a challenge. Although if anybody can pull it off, maybe he can.
So I really want to come back to the domestic piece because you've written, I think, so perceptively about Trump and the dynamics between Trump and the Republican Party. And when we were working on our book on the origins of elected strongmen, I read a lot of your stuff, especially, the one on the constitutional crisis is already here. But one thing you hear a lot for people who do kind of ring alarm bells about the threats or the risks that Trump poses to our democracy, the pushback now is, well, you told us it was going to be a big problem for democracy in his first term and nothing happened. It'd be like, well, Bob, you said our constitutional crisis is already here, but look, we weathered the storm. So we don't take seriously any, this is all alarmist and there's no threat here. There's nothing to see. How do you respond to that? Like, how would you articulate what the threat to democracy is that Trump poses in his second term?
I've lost interest in attempting to persuade anybody of any of this now. So I'm going to let it play out, and they can.
Right? I definitely hear you, but that's
But I don't. He's in power now. People, there are people I would see. You could see sort of the Wall Street Journal editorial page. They're not really happy about this, and they're not really happy about that. I'm interested to see how shocked and worried people are because he fired a bunch of career officials. I figure, from my point of view, that's the least that he was going to do, and we're not finished seeing what he's going to do. So
well, we're only
I'm
4 days in, so
pardon?
we're only 4 days in. So.
Right, like only 4 days in, and people are already, I won't deny I'm getting calls. Oh, you were right, and I'm like, you think I'm right now? I'm barely right yet. I mean, so I'm done with that. Honestly, people will now see what's going to happen, and they will react the way they're going to react. My biggest concern is that if it is the case that Trump begins increasingly to erode the rule of law and increasingly tries to just do everything he wants to do without regard to Congress or the courts or anybody else. My concern is a lot of people are going to go, yeah, fine, they'll go back to sleep. They don't care. Their own lives are unaffected. If you're a white male in America, it probably won't touch you unless you stick your head up. And to me, what I see is when I wrote a piece last, I guess it was December, warning about this, and at the end I said we were going to go out with a whimper, not with a bang. And I would say right now we are folding like a house of cards. The rapidity with which people are not only not responding to things he's doing, but are preemptively surrendering to him. I mean, watching people like Jamie Dimon just, cravenly caving to everything. Now, Jamie Dimon loves a good tariff. Elon Musk is a genius. I mean, all these people, the Jeff Bezos business, and on through, by the way, the ripple effects through society where people are now going to have to like reorient themselves to the new boss in town is just happening. And I just don't see much. I don't see much pushback. So I would say it turns out we really don't really have much of a fight in us for defending our system, as it turns out.
Yeah, you made the point earlier, and this is kind of the crux of our book on the origins of elected strongmen. Like, what happens when leaders wield disproportionate influence over the party? Because at the end of the day, the party is a really crucial constraint on a leader's attempts to expand executive power. And so how would you describe Trump's control over the Republican Party now compared to his first term? Because to me, that's really the big difference between Trump's first term and the Trump second term is the dynamic between him and the Republican Party and his more comprehensive control over the party. And now, as you said, everyone's caving folding like a house of cards. Nominations are sailing through. No one in the party is willing to stand up to Trump. And so I want to hear how you're thinking about his relationship with the Republican Party, and if there's any hope that anyone in the party is going to stand up and push back if there's an attempted overreach.
Well, I can also have that conversation about the Democratic Party, by the way. First of all, people are. I don't know why people can't see things as clearly as they are. He got elected unexpectedly in 2017. He inherited. He brought in people. He had no movement. He had no particular entourage even to bring into government, as most presidents do. If they were senators or governors, et cetera. He had none of that, and so. But what has been happening since 2017 has been his gradual consolidation, his steady and consolidation of the party. And it turns out that the most effective period of consolidation occurred, maybe not surprisingly, during the Biden administration, because it's easier to do that in opposition. You're not responsible for anything. You can just, you can blame them for everything. But it was during that period that he gradually destroyed any centers of opposition in the party, and that was completed with the defeat of Nikki Haley and her subsequent turning toward him. And so, the fact is, as long as he can command these voters, the percentage of the party that he can easily command, then he's got it, and there's nobody in particular to stop him. But it's not just the Republican Party. I find the Democratic Party, at least partially, also in a sense trying to acquiesce to what Trump represents. The party is now obsessed with looking tough on immigration, or at least not looking too soft on immigration. They don't want to look soft on crime, which means that they've given Trump, they've basically conceded Trump's two biggest issues. They're in a panic about how they've lost the working class, et cetera, et cetera. And people like John Fetterman are looking to be the new Trumpy in the Democratic Party, and I don't see anybody complaining about that either. So, unfortunately, this was also predictable. Oppositions in these situations are frequently weak and divided, and the Democratic Party is weak and divided, and in some respects cowed by the loss of this popular vote. Now, this guy won 48 point whatever percent of the vote. I don't know, 49%, whatever. He didn't even win a majority of the vote. But the lesson that Democrats have taken is that they're the ones who are screwed up, and so. Nobody wants to face the reality that the problem is with the many, many millions of Americans, period. That's where the problem begins. They are not devoted to the founder's system, and they are not. They are more perturbed about the ways in which their own class or group has been, in their view, discriminated against, and that's all they care about.
Is there any distinction left between Trump and the Republican Party, or has Trump become the Republican Party?
No. It was a takeover, and the takeover is now complete. There is no Republican Party independent of Donald Trump. There may be some senators here and there who may pop up there, briefly before they retire, like Mitch McConnell. But when Mitch McConnell retires, then that'll be there is no way to be in opposition to Donald Trump in the Republican Party today. So it is. And by the way, I mean, you raised this earlier. We used to think of parties as being the two-party system as being very beneficial in some respects, because the tendency, people thought, was to amalgamate different views, including extreme views, and sort of tame them for public distribution, as it were. But it turns out that the parties were a trapdoor in the Constitution in a way that the founders didn't even conceive of political parties. They didn't think that there could be a national party. The states were too divided amongst themselves for that to happen. Their interests are too different. But it turns out that party loyalty destroys the system that the founders set up. To me, the analogy for me is like it's like, how did the Titanic go down? It's because the iceberg cut across all these chambers that were supposed to set, and that's what the party is doing. So the party has infiltrated. The founders imagined that Congress would be jealous of its own prerogatives versus the executive, versus the president, and therefore it would always act in its own institutional interest. Party loyalty has only fairly recently destroyed that. It used to be true that even people of the president's own party would resist what they regarded as excessive presidential encroachment, for instance, with FDR and the court backing, which many of his own party opposed. So that Congress is now, because of party, been taken out. And it turns out that the Supreme Court also is just partisan. I mean, you saw that in the Bush v. Gore vote. And now you've seen it repeatedly, particularly on the Trump immunity question, et cetera. That party, it trumps, so to speak, institutional independence. And that has turned out, therefore, to be the thing that cuts across the sort of the structures that were established to try to prevent someone like this from taking power.
Jim's going to get so mad, but just one thing, because it's not really party loyalty, though. It's loyalty to Trump. And I think therein lies the problem, is that people are not loyal to the Republican Party and its long-term reputation. It's like increasingly people view their fates as tied to Trump, not the party.
No, it's true. But I'm just saying, if there were no party to the existence of the party and the fact that it is captured by this individual, but the fact that the party touches all these different, cuts through all the institutions. But of course, you're totally right that the party is not. Now, on the other hand, I'm not sure that you could argue right now, especially, that the party as an R, has actually been damaged. They've got the White House and both houses of Congress, and are likely to keep it for some time to come. 26 is probably not going to be a big reversal unless things just change in a very dramatic way. In fact, in the Senate, it's less hospitable to Democrats than 24 was in terms of what's available. So I don't think you could say the Republican Party's been damaged by this. Only the country has.
Wait, Jim. I'm sorry, Jim.
No. You're asking great questions. I've got 1,000 of them, but a couple things real quick. One is, one thing I have my students read is Washington's farewell address. I have them read it because I want to give them an idea of how U.S. foreign policy, in terms of not joining alliances, this type of thing. I wanted them to see I wanted them to read it from the guy who invented that whole thing. And so, but if you read the farewell address as an American, and talking about factions, what Washington was saying and warning about factions, it's a fascinating read. And so, for all of our Brussels sprouts listeners out in Europe, you can Google that, and I really recommend you reading that warning from Washington. But going back to the Democratic Party, though, it is just breathtaking to me, and you've alluded to this as well. It's breathtaking to me, the total collapse. A house of cards. That's the Democratic Party too. I can't believe that collapse. And also, I remember so well that first year of Trump's first term, we were in the streets almost every week. I was in the streets. Whether it was Black Lives Matter, whatever, we were not too violent, but we were being shot by rubber bullets like everybody else. We were out there, and it was all the time. The resistance idea was everywhere, and it is just it's the whimper. It's truly a whimper. So my question for you is, this house of cards that collapsed so completely a year ago, you would never have expected such a collapse. All of these Democrats strutting around, both within the Biden administration, the people I call the cool kids within the Biden administration, but those in the Democratic Party more widely, just walking around like, they were, victory was ours, and it was going to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, boom, it falls apart, and you don't even hear the whimper. How did that happen? That's a big question. You can answer it however you'd like, but to me, it's just such a total collapse. Or is it? Maybe it's not. Maybe they're going to come busting out from some think tank and come onto the scene, and I don't know. To me, what is just fascinating is the complete collapse of the Democratic Party.
Well, historians will be writing about this literally for 100 years. So I'm not going to, and there'll be 15 different interpretations, and there's already 15 interpretations. And I don't want to go there. They lost an election, which I think if you had just written in names and the circumstances, I think this was obviously a Republican election. It was reasonable to expect a Republican to win this election. What was not reasonable to expect is that this guy won this election. And most of what we're saying is not, oh, the Democrats really should have won. They were so great. The Biden administration was so successful. It was not successful, and it was not even successful in the area where they wanted to claim that they were successful, which is foreign policy. Their foreign policy was not successful, okay, to say the very least. And so it's not surprising that the voters voted them out. And by the way, not to mention, they had a geriatric guy who could barely finish a sentence, and then they had a very weak candidate who never was a successful candidate on the national stage ever. So why we were shocked if she didn't pull off a victory? She did remarkably well given who she was. So there's no shock about that. The shock had already taken place, which was, whatever your beef is with what's going on in the world, in what way is Donald Trump the answer? Right. And I think what we failed to see, and what no one wants even to see right now, is that the problem is, again, tens of millions of Americans who don't care I would say don't know to some extent, but I think it's too well known not to really know. So I would say didn't care about the threat that Donald Trump manifestly, he already tried to overthrow the government once. I mean, so that should have, the fact that that's not disqualifying means that there are such poisons in our system
Yeah.
where people, their hatreds for the liberals, the Democrats, the elite, whatever you want to call it, Trump, overwhelmed any concern that they might have about electing somebody who already tried to overthrow the U.S. government. So, the Democratic Party can beat itself up all it wants. And obviously, you could name 15 ways in which the Democratic Party didn't do what it could have done better, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a larger problem than the Democratic Party. This is a problem of the American public.
And
And
what do you say about us? Drill down on what you just said. You're absolutely right. So what if you're a European or someone watching this from the outside? What does that say about us as a people?
it says that we're normal human beings, and that's the thing. And I mean, this is, again, it's hard to wrap your head around this, but what the American experiment, which was a complete, it really was unique in history. No government had ever been founded on the principle of universal individual rights against the government and against community, et cetera, et cetera. The whole principle of everybody having individual rights against the government was, no government has ever been founded on that principle. And it requires a certain level of, the founders would have said virtue, but at the very least, a commitment to the abstract principle of universal individual rights. Now, human beings love rights for themselves. They want to defend their own rights, but historically, they have not only not cared about the rights of people who are different from them, speak differently, look differently, believe in different gods, etc., but they have been positively confident that those people does not deserve rights. So the hard thing has been saying not just people who look and sound like me, but the people who don't look and sound like me, they also get their rights protected. That requires a level of almost, it runs to some extent against human nature, the natural tribalism of human nature. But that is what the founders set up. At the time of the revolution, at the time of the founding, a huge portion of the country did not agree with the principles of the Declaration of Independence. They did not believe that all people were created equal. They did not believe that blacks were equal or deserved equal rights. Half the country did not believe, more than half the country didn't believe that Catholics should have rights because it was a Protestant country and Catholicism is papism and evil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it has always been the case that the American people have not been entirely in sync with the principles on which the government was founded. So I think we believed, as good Enlightenment liberals that we are, that over time people would become educated, they would get over it, they would stop being prejudiced, et cetera, et cetera. And that's our mistake. People never get over it. And people never get over the inherent tribalism that they feel. And, 100 years after the end of the Civil War, the South was still ready effectively to secede again to prevent desegregation. And so why are we shocked that those people are still around and able to, take control of the system? So I think what you're seeing is the failure of the system in a way that was predictable in some respects. And both, Thomas Jefferson writes in the midst of the revolution that he was worried that as soon as the war was over, people would forget that they were fighting for rights, et cetera. They would lose their passion for rights. Lincoln, right, in his Lyceum speech, and I think it was 1837 or 1838, is lamenting the fact that Americans clearly have lost their passion for rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you had to ask me what's going on, it's that, yes, we're in an advanced state of not caring about the fundamental principles on which our country was founded. And it really shouldn't be so shocking. Now, there is also a struggle to be had, and there has always been a struggle. And this is the thing that we also forget about our history. We have always been grappling and fighting with each other over whether to advance the cause of the founders' liberalism or whether to hold back. And you could go through history, and there's 15 different, and these movements have existed before, the John Birch Society and McCarthyism, et cetera. So unfortunately, what you're seeing is humanity showing its way through our exceptional system. Our system was exceptional. The ideals were exceptional. The American people are just like everybody else.
Wow, wow. That was incredible. Just incredible.
I think that, I mean, that I like that point so much. I mean, because the way that we've talked about it and others like Milan Spalik and others have written about it is, I mean, you can still love democracy. You can still, I mean, but your point about not valuing the rights of other people. So I guess the way I conceive of what's happening is, with polarization and these hatred between groups running so high, you can still like democracy, but you're willing to accept and tolerate a leader who abuses power if it means keeping the other side out. So yes, we all think we're good Democrats, but we like our side and we dislike the other side so much. We're going to let that slide just as long as it helps us and hurts them. So I think that the hatred and the divide and the polarization is really one of the key enablers, the fuel that's really, I think, driving a lot of this.
Right. But again, it's worth remembering that this polarization is not new either. I mean, at the end of the 19th century, people, when they died, had it engraved on their gravestones, Democrat, Republican. I mean, that was, how passionate it was, because there is more to it than just the party issue. It's what you stand for, and whether the Republican Party was the party that eradicated slavery, the Democrats were the party that were trying to hold on to the lost cause, etc. So it's just the polarization is not new. And it just one other point, which is it is important to remember the founders did not set out to establish a democracy. They rightly believed that only a democracy could be trusted to protect individual rights at all. But the goal was the protection of rights, and democracy was a means, which, by the way, they hedged against a lot in the system, because, and that's, I think, what we forget. The goal of American society, according to the founders, is not democracy, although it has to be democracy. The goal is the protection of rights. And that is what people are, and we see this in this election. An election does not, according to the founders' system of government and their understanding of government, an election does not confer a mandate to invade people's rights. That's impossible. Government cannot do that under any circumstance. That's what natural rights mean. That's what people are born with rights. Government doesn't give them rights, and an election cannot give permission to a government to do that. But that is what is being taken. The mandate is to do whatever he wants to immigrants and their families. The mandate is to do what you want to stop, taking into account what America did to Black people for 2 centuries in making judgments about what to do today. I mean, I think that's at the root of this.
Okay, final question. We've kept you long enough. But your crystal ball has worked very well in the past. So if you're looking forward, what happens to the Republican Party after Trump? This is the question you ask about Russia. Does Putinism outlast Putin? Does Trumpism outlast Trump?
I think Trump's a unique figure in the way he's been established as a kind of mythic icon, leader in pardon me for using the word that you're not allowed to use, in a kind of fascist sense. I mean, the key element of fascism is that there is one person who is looking out for the interests of the nation and knows how to lead the nation, and it's better for the nation to let that person lead, and that's clearly what we have. So I don't think it's obvious that there is another figure out there that can command that kind of broad allegiance. So one thing that you might say is that the party is likely to split up into factions, that movement may follow different leaders and therefore split up. I am hopeful that at the end of the day, it isn't even about Trump or not Trump. In a way, it's about demographics. At the end of the day, this was still, I'm sorry, built on a white majority, and the whites are not going to be a majority of voters. Now, it's also true that men are still going to be around, and this was a big male vote. This was driven a lot by men, although obviously women voted more for Trump than people expected to. So anyway, I think that demographically, it's going to be hard to sustain a party built fundamentally on white supremacy. On the other hand, I myself would say don't underestimate the apathy of the average person of any race or ethnicity, as long as they've got, they feel like they're getting theirs. But in answer to an earlier question, the Democratic Party doesn't have to come up with a program. It doesn't have to, reinvent itself. It just has to be in opposition and seize the opportunities it has to beat Trump up if he's doing unpopular things. So, for instance, they want to be tough on crime. They should be raising a stink about releasing these criminals who beat up and, in some cases, killed policemen. They should be making a huge issue out of that. If they were capable of becoming the Democratic Party of Dean Acheson and John F. Kennedy, I would say they should be pointing out the degree to which Trump is basically caving to Russia and increasingly to China as well. I don't know why. They all voted for the TikTok ban. Why aren't they yelling and screaming about the TikTok ban? Are they worried about their youthful voters who are going to be mad at them? Maybe. But it's not as if there isn't an opposition program building, and there's going to be other things. And if the Democrats weren't so busy trying to Me Too Trump, which is what a lot of them are doing, they would have an opportunity. The cruelty of this anti-immigration movement is something that I think Democrats should make a big deal out of. But I fear that they won't because they're scared of the issue. So, it's not over for the Democratic Party. It's like grow up and be an opposition party and stop, feeling sorry for yourself.
This was great, Bob. What a fun, this is a great, fun conversation. Yeah. I'm really thankful that you took the time to join us, and I'm sure everyone will enjoy listening to this one. So yeah,
well, thank you.
Like you guys, you're going to have to hide because we'd love to have you back at some point.
Well, it's a pleasure talking with you.
I will make my students listen to this for sure. They're going to have them listen to this in the spring. So you might get some mail, from these people, but they're going to have to understand this.
Okay, as long as it's not hate mail, it's okay. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.